Welcome to a new video of the Omnis on-demand training series, Omnis Studio Web Development Basics. Today, it's all about user input. In other words, how can the user feed us or our application with information? Let's go. In the first video in this series, we looked at the button, which, just like its derivatives, the floating action button, the split button, etc., also represents a user input. However, today we're going to take a look at components that actively change a value. These components include the input field, radio buttons, checkboxes, and switches. Well, I suggest we'll start in the classic way, with the input field. To do this, I'm now back in our training library and I open the remote form to which I want to add an input field. In my case, this is the Hello World remote form. We can find the input field, or rather the input fields, as there are two types, in the component store under Entry Fields. There we have the classic variant, with the same name as the category and the rich text editor. The rich text editor comes with an entire UI toolset to enable users to format the text they are entering. However, it should be noted that then the data will then be fed into the app as HTML text. With the classic input field, we simply get an easy-to-use string back. Therefore, let's turn to the classic input field first. So, the rich text editor can go away again. By the way, this is very easy. Select the object by clicking on it, and then simply delete it with the delete key. But what does the input field do, and how can we access the entered data? The first part of the question is easy to answer. Let's just test the form. So, we see our input field here and can now enter something here as a user. I think that's self-explaining. But how can we now catch the data or continue working with it? If we go back to the design editor and look at the properties of the input field, we see $DataName property. Here we can specify an instance variable, which is then used by the input field as a kind of memory. Important: it must be an instance variable. By the way, in the next video, I'll show you what an instance variable is and what other types of variables there are. But for now, let's get back to today's topic. Let's start by defining an instance variable. Variables are always defined or edited in the method editor. The scope or table for the variables is located at the top here. It's important to note that this tab bar belongs to it and filters the variable table according to the selected scope. In our case, we must therefore ensure that the instance scope is selected so that we can define an instance variable. If the correct scope is selected, we can now define a new variable by clicking in an empty row or simply edit an existing definition. The first column now contains the name of our variable. In the Omnis world, the first letter of the variable typically designates the scope. For example, T for task, C for class, I for instance, L for local, and P for parameter. For our variable, if I actually want to call it input entry, this means that I now call it IInputEntry. Great. Now, our variable is defined, and by default as a character, i.e. as a string of characters. As I said, you'll learn more about variables in the next video. For today, the type and subtype are of no interest, and we leave everything as it is, and can now finally enter the variable IInputEntry in the $DataName of our input field. In order to check whether everything is working, we now output the entered value as a message with the existing button. To do this, as known from the first video, the Hello World part, I go to the $event method of the button, and instead of the text that we entered here in the brackets, I now enter our instance variable here. Very nice. Now let's test it. So I press Command-T. In Windows, this would be Control-T. And then I press the button, and we see it worked. Wonderful. By the way, this application does not necessarily need a button to read the data from the input field, because the values in the input field are saved directly to the variable in real time, so you can access them at any time. This is a great advantage. For example, if you use this as a search field and want to display new suggestions directly after each new letter entered, as with Google, for example, where I also get a drop-down list with suggestions directly without having pressed a button. Now, let's take a look at the radio buttons, checkboxes, and switches. I'll first drag these three components into the form. Then we need variables for these components. The three components now no longer allow direct input of data, but only provide the user with a selection. Accordingly, the information that will be written to the variable are also different. For example, the radio buttons store a number that reflects the selected option, 0 for the first option, 1 for the second, and so on. The checkbox saves a 1 for checked and a 0 for unchecked. The switch behaves in exactly the same way as the checkbox. But let's take a closer look at this in test mode later. For now, I first create the three variables: I input radio, I input checkbox, and I input switch. By the way, you don't need to always include input in the variable name, but I used to do it as then I always know exactly that this is a variable for an input. Now, just link the variables to the components. So we linked the radio buttons to the I input radio variable, the checkbox with the I input checkbox variable, and the switch with the I input switch variable. And to make sure we can conveniently view the values, I add a button for each control that outputs the value, like in the Hello World example in our first video. So here are three buttons. And they all get the same code in the $event method as the button for the input field. But of course, we have to exchange the variable. So I'll fast forward. You already know that. Now, let's take a look at it. When I click on the second option here, I should now get a 2, top. The checkbox is now checked, so I should get a 1. If we remove the check, we should actually get a 0, but we don't. This is because if we pass a 0, 0 or simply nothing at all, the $show message, there is no pop-up either. The same is true for the switch. On gives a 1, off shows nothing. Perfect. Now we can go one step further and also determine the position of the selection without input from the user. This means, for example, that the second option of the radio buttons is automatically selected or switch is already set to on. And this is very easy as we can simply assign the target value to the linked variable. And in our example, we can link all components to the same variable, and the values should then synchronize automatically. To do this, I just enter the I input entry variable in the $data name of all components. It's that simple. So, let's test this. That's cool. We can now see the new value directly in the input field without having to press a button. So here we can see live again the real-time processing of the data that I mentioned earlier. And now to the last cool feature that I want to show you today. You can also read the values of variables during debugging. Imagine something doesn't work as you intended in this app. So you make a breakpoint to check the code during execution. For example, after the Hello World button in the $event method. Then you can, wait a second, I'll just test, change a value, and click on the button so that we get into the debugger. Then you can simply hover the mouse over the name of a variable, either here at the top of the table or directly in the code, and read out the value. You could also right-click on the name like this and display the value in a separate window. This can be really helpful if you're looking for an error and want to know whether the data is correct at all or when it becomes incorrect. And if you want to know how you can process the data from the inputs, please make sure to watch the next videos, because after the video about variables, or rather, their scopes, we'll look at how you can implement your own methods and logic. So, I recommend you subscribe directly to our channel to make sure you won't miss any of the videos. Wonderful! That's all for today. In our next video, we'll take a look at which scopes there are, which other types of variables there are, and what they mean. See you soon. Take care.